What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki. I'm coming at you with a video that I've been working on for quite a while. I've got multiple iterations, done like 30-minute recordings and deleted, etc. This is a topic I've been kind of poking at for a while now, and it's going to ultimately be broken down over multiple videos just because there's a whole gamut of topics to cover here. But this is on how the Aum Shinrikyo, aka the Japanese cult responsible for the Tokyo Sarin gas attack, which is the most heinous act of domestic terrorism that Japan has ever actually encountered, is. So I just kind of real quick want to just do an explanation, like for those of you who are new to the channel. Primarily My Hero Academia content, discuss analysis videos on that. I obviously branch out occasionally. This happens to just be one that's also going to be incorporating cult topics, but I do want to do more content on different topics depending on how much time I have available in the future, etc. So you're caught up to speed. This is for manga readers. If you're an anime only for My Hero Academia, you're eventually going to get spoiled in this video. I'm telling you that now. All right, cool, boom. We all understand each other. Let's keep going. So main reason why I want to talk about the Aum Shinrikyo and My Hero Academia is because I don't see anybody talk about it. It's really that simple. It's actually very heavily intertwined with the actual narrative of the series, especially incorporated into the League of Villains. When you look at the way they're recruiting, who they talk to, their ideology, and their beliefs, and the way it lines up with the overall impact of the story and what Horikoshi's been trying to tell. I think this is especially worth noting because it's derivative of the fact that while Horikoshi was 8 years old, as he was born in November of 1986, is it 1986? Yeah, 1986. But the Tokyo Sarin gas attack took place in 95 on March 20th. Now, he would have been 8 years old witnessing an event comparable to 9/11 in the sense that its range and destructiveness was across multiple metropolitan areas. The Tokyo Sarin gas attack was an attack orchestrated by Shoko Asahara, the leader of this Aum Shinrikyo cult, in which he placed 5 different scientists, doctors, chemists type people onto trains, sent them into the Tokyo metropolitan area at around 8:30 in the morning or during rush hour traffic. I think it's actually around 8 a.m. And then what they would do there is each of them was given a bag, and inside that bag were several containers of sarin liquid gas. They would take these customized umbrellas with special tips and stab the bags, producing a leak, allowing the liquid to spill onto the train. As it spilled, it would interact with the air, releasing a dangerous nerve agent, causing coughing of blood, blindness, just in general suffering, racks damage. People would collapse instantly. A man would go to clean this up, and he would eventually end up dying, collapsing within minutes of touching the agent. People who picked up the packages to throw them away were pretty much guaranteed death. Only a man who quickly managed to wash his hands and face while still collapsing and passing out for several days was one of the survivors that actually came into physical contact with these containers. So this was an extremely huge deal. The sarin gas was actually outlawed, and it's actually an invention of the Nazis around the 1940s. So understand that sarin gas isn't even allowed per the laws of war. And yet Japan had a large-scale attack of this magnitude using this weapon, killing 13 people, ultimately blinding and crippling about 1,000, and just in general damaging 5,000 people. I think it's kind of interesting to note, though, that like this heavy attack only killed 13 people, and I think that kind of influences, for example, this Liberation War arc that I think Horikoshi, their biggest tragedy doesn't revolve around 1 million people dying in a day. It revolves around thousands of people being injured, a couple people dying, but a lot of people living with permanent damage and having to come to terms with that, and an unease settling in through society. Because the thing is also, when a bunch of people die, yes, there's a void, but you can kind of walk past that. When there's a lot of cripplings, then you become more likely to encounter these people, have interactions with them, and have to deal with the ramifications of what's happened to them. And I think that's part of why we are such a heavy focus on the civilians, especially with what's going on in the story and how he's been consistently talking about deconstructing society, their idea of peace, and what they have and what they believe in. Now, the primary beliefs of the Aum Shinrikyo, when you want to boil it down, borrows tenets from Hinduism, Buddhism. You have the standard path of enlightenment chasing, the idea of worshiping the divine, doing yoga. You have the standard practices with the breathing, But the big tenet, obviously, of this Aum Shinrikyo was that Shoko Asahara was effectively God incarnate. He was to be considered the anointed of Shiva, Buddha, and even calling himself Christ in his book, Declaring Myself the Christ. This also kind of explains, for those of you who have been keeping up with this channel as well, some of the parallels between Shigaraki and Jesus that we've talked about, and overall Christ figures. With the stigmata in his palms, walking towards all for one in the crucifixion pose, etc. So some of those were, while yes, references to Revelations and all those other things, but also a nod towards Shoko Asahara's claim of divinity to be like Christ. He would even, just to prove a point, send his DNA to other people to get it tested to prove he had special blood, even though that ended up being false. But there's also a lot of things that, when you boil down the way he recruited people, he tended to target people that were in the middle upper class. He had a lot of people who were chemists, physicists, and those like in their early to mid 20s who pulled in and really decided to follow him because they didn't feel comfortable or weren't happy with the hyper exam focused society that Japan has, and they weren't necessarily happy with the direction the economy was going. They had grown up in a time of high commercialism, similar to this hero society, in which everything was kind of a period of peace and prosperity within the country. And then some of these people just weren't fitting in with the things that were maintaining these pillars. That idea of like that natural white collar Japanese businessman structure archetype, all those things that were holding us together while trotting down on the people who weren't necessarily happy, or the people who got to become scientists only to realize that their opportunities and their explorations for fields were going to be limited to only what the government or some corporation told them they were allowed to study. And that might not necessarily be what they got into it. So some of these chemists and physicists and scientists were moved, and the Aum Shinrikyo appealed to them due to the fact that it was allowed them to express themselves freely, to tap into their individualities, if you will. Which, for those of you who didn't get what I just did there, the original translation of kosei isn't actually quirk, but individuality. That's one that ended up being kind of a fanlation translation, and then it stuck and was carried through, and like Caleb Cook decided to honor the fandom in that original translation. And it definitely has made its ways and strides, but also when you, again, use the word individuality, you see more connections to why these people would feel repressed in certain ways, and they would lash out and join these cults. Now, some of the baseline parallels here is that Shoko Asahara also sold things such as his blood to followers and would mix that into beverages, and they were to drink that. So you kind of have the toga being one parallel for the disabled or mentally ill people who don't necessarily fit in with society being discarded and just kind of labeled as like a freak. But then you also have the fact that she's literally a one-to-one comparison to the cult leaders or followers who, while their time there, were ingesting blood. I also should point out that Shoko Asahara is the originator of selling his gamer girl bathwater, not Belle Delphine. And I would also like to point out that it gets a little deeper when you look at specifically characters like Spinner. A lot of people have seen the Moshi Moshi Jesus image where it's like Jesus answering a telephone. A lot of people have seen some of the tweets I've said where, like, these little images are really important to understanding My Hero Academia, but they also kind of help explain the anime and manga industry as a whole and like some of the weird slights. The Jesus anime that you, like, guy that you typically see, that phone answering Jesus, is actually Shoko Asahara. The Aum Shinrikyo created anime as advertisement. They would make these animes so that you could believe that Shoko Asahara had special powers within his hands and he was capable of great things. He released photos of himself levitating, and he would also claim to have the ability to link up with people's minds. What's interesting is that eventually the cult would in fact sell you technology allowing you to link with his mind in the form of a helmet. This is kind of reminiscent of the fact that Shoko Asahara taught them that they were all extensions of his will to a certain degree. That if Shoko Asahara is divine, then so his will should be, and they should be a part and want to be unified with him in his greatness. If this doesn't ring any bells, though, you can also think about the fact that Shigaraki and All for One use radio waves to control the mindless Nomu. and link them to their minds directly through those blasts. So you can see some of these parallels in the execution are starting to build up here. Now, when we look at the otaku stuff, though, we got to go back to Spinner, who we see was big into the comics, big into the video games. There's also an Aum Shinrikyo video game. Now, there's questions as to whether or not it's actually meant to be made by them, but the logo that boots up when the video game starts is Aum Soft, which seems to imply that it was their studios and developers who made this video game. The video game used genuine campaign footage of the dances, had photographs of a lawyer that the cult went out of their way to murder by breaking into his house, bashing him and his wife's heads in with hammers and stomping them out, while also injecting the baby with poison and then eventually taking their bodies, distributing them across the country, and smashing their teeth so that there was no evidence. Obviously, it took several years before those corpses were found. So there's all of these little ties that make it a very suspicious and alarming video game piece of media, because what the game's premise was that you would go around and effectively gas and do terrorist attacks across the nation. You could argue that there's a chance that they were trying to normalize and radicalize youth to being terrorists and doing Aum Shinrikyo's will. And ultimately, if you got to the bad or good ending, nuclear war would happen, or you would see that Shoko Asahara had achieved new powers and he would fly through. And while many people would have died because of a great nuclear war that was supposed to happen, his people and his flock, his followers, they would live, they would survive. And you see, this is also mirrored in Dabi. We have another thing with Dabi here, where as people were doing training for the Aum Shinrikyo, you would be doing these intense yoga exercise routines. People would be tied upside down with ropes and suspended for hours. They would bathe in waters that would be 122 degrees Fahrenheit and be fully submerged in them for long periods of time. Just various hard tests. And every now and then, after a while, members would die. Now, if you're a member and you can't pass these tests or progress, you're kind of unworthy, not fit to be within the Aum Shinrikyo, and you would end up dying. Or these people would attempt to flee because they would think that the tests were too hard, or they would be struggling, and they'd realize that they got into something with this cult that they weren't fully prepared to deal with. And if you were in that position, you would end up murdered. Pretty much guaranteed, strangled, stabbed, whatever. And the primary method to get rid of those bodies wasn't some barrel of acid, it was cremation. Now, if you think towards Dabi's behavior throughout the series, he tends to be wandering the streets, hitting the beat, trying to evangelize people into the League of Villains. Those who he deems unworthy, who fail the test, they aren't released back into the mainstream society, but rather they are charred and cremated into piles of ash to be, left. He is effectively a manifestation of the judgment and an extension of the worthiness of the League of Villains and Shigaraki's will, keeping in mind that a lot of those same people that Dabi ran into wouldn't have respected Shigaraki right off the bat either. Thus, more than likely, Shigaraki himself also would have destroyed them. You see how this works now. Furthermore, the Aum Shinrikyo also exploited the economic impact of a recession during the early 90s. You see, there was a massive economic bubble similar to the way that the U.S. recently was popping and having a lot of money, just income flowing. And then, just like these modern millennials, or many modern millennials, I live alone, people ended up having to live with their parents, move back in, just a lot of economic issues causing a massive downturn, leading to some serious issues. This same way that economic issues are what led to a lot of these people living with their parents, this is kind of reflected in Twice, because we see Twice as a backstory and we think of it as, oh yeah, Twice quirk made him crazy, his clones tried to kill himself. But then when we go further back, we realize that Twice was born he was born with parents. They were quickly dead. He ended up alone. He was already an outcast from society, similar to how otakus were seen at the time during the 80s and 90s, and they felt so. And then that you have with Spinner, who was also that lizard. So you see we have that going. You see that we have, again, Toga, the disabled person, being an outcast. You have Dabi, the failed oldest son, who's essentially a lunatic, the failed outcast, and now you have twice somebody who's failed within the economic systems. The same thing that the Aum Shinrikyo took advantage of. For example, they would have you work in different restaurants in their areas, and then as a turn, they would evangelize you while you were on the clock, try to get you to join, radicalize you, get you to become a member of the Aum Shinrikyo, and then once you became a member, you would inevitably end up having to forfeit all of your assets to Shoko Asahara and his religion and his cult. This is similar to how, if you think about it, once Shigaraki and the League of Villains took over the Meta-Human Liberation Army, and their defeating of him, he took over their estate. He took over their assets. They gave him everything, any science he needed, any medical care, any money, food. He took their estate. All of this plays into that. Keep in mind also, with Overhaul, he takes him out, takes over his estate. If you look back to the Hosu City arc, you have, once again, he recruits Stain. Stain isn't exactly what he wants, but he recruits him, he gets his clout, he eventually takes his social capital, effectively taking Stain's estate. Even specifically going back to the Hosu City arc, now we can start talking about some more of the Shigaraki and Shoko Asahara parallels. During Hosu City specifically, you look at Shigaraki as a man campaigning for the hearts and fears of hero society. In turn, he's effectively running against Stain during the Hosu City arc. He doesn't want Stain to be the one that's famous and popular. So in turn, he releases those 3 Nomu. He says it himself, we'll see tomorrow in the headlines whether or not I'm happy with the plan. Only for him to lose, effectively, the press battle. Stain being captured makes him the forefront of entertainment or of interest, and makes him what the people really want to see and hear about, especially with the propagation of his manifesto. In the real world, similarly enough, Shoko Asahara, before he decided to reach out to the Russians and acquire attack helicopters, AK-47s, potentially have them infiltrate the Japanese government so that they could get approved for religious status, making them exempt and harder to investigate, and furthermore getting tanks and various chemical weapons, etc. from Russia, he did try to run for actual parliament because, just like Shigaraki was going to be the king of villains, from the time he was young, Shoko Asahara decided that he would be the king of Japan or the prime minister. So when he failed in Hosu City, it was similar to the way Shoko Asahara in real life set out to be a member of politics only for his party to gather a mere 1,020 votes amongst 24 delegates that were people who were running for office. While Shoko Asahara believed himself to be a divine ruler that would easily be accepted, it was obvious that the rest of Japan did not feel the same way about him. If you think back to the way Shigaraki acted during the USJ arc, that certain level of entitlement and expectation that things would go his way, that kind of is mirrored again, these entitlements, this tendency towards violence, and ultimately one of the main key components here when we're discussing this religious aspect is that Shoko Asahara, like I mentioned earlier, claimed to be anointed by Shiva. Shiva being the Hindu goddess of destruction. Now, he chose to be anointed by Shiva specifically to justify his later violent behaviors. He would go on to instruct people to commit many murders, as I mentioned earlier, such as the one with a lawyer, but he would also, because he was trying to weaponize anthrax, potentially cause danger to multiple civilian areas, as he literally sprayed aerosol anthrax off of a rooftop. If he had done it correctly, they would have been able to kill thousands more than likely, as anthrax has an 85% fatality rate when inhaled. I know some of you are wondering if anthrax was bad. There's your answer. So you see, as he's campaigning, as he's failing, he's still consuming these villains' estates. One of the things that I find fascinating is that I had thought that when I found out that Shoko Asahara was executed in July 6th of 2018, that Horikoshi might have done some last minute bid to get into contact with the guy or talk to him just to pick his crazy cult leader's brain to further pad out or explain this manga. But then I found out that when you're on death row in Japan and you're going to be executed, they don't announce when that's happening. You just one day get taken into a room, you're hung, and then they go tell people, hey, we hung that guy, he's dead. So July 6, 2018, Shoko Asahara is hung and my hero's on break. So I had initially thought that that's where that parallel came from. But then I realized something important. that Shoko Asahara's daughter was also actively campaigning against the death penalty at this time, doing a tour in which we also see that many people to this day heavily resent Shoko Asahara, to the extent where a grown man almost attacked her while she was speaking on the death penalty because he felt like she was just trying to keep her father alive. So as you can see, throughout the story, we have a lot of these parallels building up with Dabi being the test for the cult members. Just the big thing here, though, is how Shoko Asahara died and what was going on before he died. Because we kind of have to talk about where Shigaraki is right now and where he could end up by the end of the story if Horikoshi wants to lean more into the Shoko Asahara and the cult leader bag instead of potentially leaning into his Star Wars bag. Where Shoko Asahara went to prison in around 1996. Well, he was on trial for a long period, but he stopped speaking and basically went entirely mute after about 4 or 5 years, decided not to speak, and took to pooping himself and having to wear diapers, etc., not eating, even masturbating in front of his own daughter when she visited him in prison. Due to this, there is potential for Shigaraki to never be free. The reason why I say this is because there's something interesting about the idea of Deku acquiring a power that is a long black rope the same year that Shoko Asahara was hung. And so when you look back at this Paranormal Liberation War arc, there's potential to say that the reason that Deku and Shigaraki had this big fight in the air was that it was effectively Deku hanging Shigaraki, putting a death to his career. If that's the case, then we have an entirely different angle that we need to look at the story from and accept the fact that Vestige, for one, may be playing a bigger part in this story going forward than we initially expected. That being said, I don't believe that Shoko Asahara is going to be the be-all, end-all for Shigaraki's character. I do think that with the Tenko philosophy being attached, that more than likely what we'll have is both the rejection of the name Tomura Shigaraki, as when Shoko Asahara was originally born, Shizuo Matsumoto. Shoko Asahara is the name he chose when he became the great guru. So if we see a rejection of the name Tomura Shigaraki and a re-establishment of Tenko, then I could see that being how Shigaraki's character eventually comes out of this. However, him going back to Tenko is not him going back to Tenko Shimura. I want to make sure that's abundantly clear. I just simply mean Tenko. A complete rejection of both All For One and his family, completely embracing his own identity and moving forward that way. So there's obviously dozens of other things that I could incorporate here, where, for example, the fact that Shoko Asahara had a lot of allies in Russia and we're getting a lot of talks of international heroes could imply that we will be getting international villains who want to come in and be loyal to Shigaraki, specifically Russian ones. The extent that Shoko Asahara's influence goes in Russia is that he had about 10K members at peak in Japan, but he had about 30,000 in Russia. Even recently, in about 2015, 2016, the small European nation of Montenegro found about 50 cultists, now in the branch Aleph, stationed there and eventually had to deport them. There's been arrests made as recently, I believe, as 2016, 2017 within Russia, finding active members of Aleph. There are also Hikari Nowari and other cult offshoots that are still active today, though many have denounced Shoko Asahara. In general, I just hope that you learned something about this today, because the reality is that when I kind of look at the way this cult influenced Japan, they have led to Japan having an 80% support of the death penalty. They've led to, which I think is going to be mirrored. It won't be 1-to-1. This will not be everybody in the My Hero verse says, yeah, kill a villain on sight. But I do think that 80% approval rate that number specifically might come into play here when we start talking about whether or not people deserve the right to use their quirks, whether they deserve the right to defend themselves. That certain trend. So if we start seeing especially that, then you know that this is really where Horikoshi is pulling from, showing this idea that this cult that happened in our world, you can translate that and put this into a world of superpowers and make it believable. But that does bring a question for me the idea that sometimes people feel like My Hero doesn't have stakes, because now we need to ask ourselves, are we so violence desensitized that we see events comparable to and exceeding the greatest domestic terrorist act in Japan history, or in modern history, I should say, and we feel like, it's not that bad? And I'm not going to say we feel, because I personally don't feel that way. I do feel like everything's been delivered upon that we were actually promised. But I do think there's something to be said about us witnessing intense violence within the series and then going, it's not that intense. When effectively My Hero Academia is a retelling of Japan's modern history in the future. One of the things that I'll probably be making another video is on how All Might specifically is another tie-in to the religious structure of Japan, being that what he brought and ensued was the rush hour of the gods, which is part of the reason why the Aum Shinrikyo took so long to be caught, because they couldn't be properly investigated because of the fact that Japan didn't want to look like they were persecuting other religions, especially after a history of literally executing people for being Christian, for example, for over like 200 years. So there's certain aspects that Japan was kind of trying to rehab their image from that kind of led to the Aum Shinrikyo being so influential and powerful within there. So just realize though that, and remember this wasn't just the downtrodden, and that's even reflected in the League of Villains, because while yes, Twice was a poor person, Himiko Toga doesn't, and was like disabled. She didn't seem to come from poverty. Also realized that Dabi definitely does not come from poverty. They were able to pull influential people. These were people who became certified doctors, people who were as old as like 50, and realized that these cults do actually exist. So this cautionary tale makes sense for Horikoshi to be kind of pointing this out, that like we need to be actually focused on taking care of each other as a society instead of just ignoring these problems, because it festers and bubbles into this. But understand that cults are so prolific in Japan that the freshman orientation classes for a lot of universities do come with, please don't get caught by a cult type lessons. And so that's also part of why, for example, in Jujutsu Kaisen, that you notice that the teachers seemed kind of like very iffy about the existence of even having an occult club. It's very much stems from these concerns, where in modern history, they have very recent memories of a cult reaching out and doing massive acts of terrorist destruction. So that incorporation, and also I'm going to also point out too that Shoko Asahara, when he decided to declare his cult and go on this massive path, was in the Shibuya prefecture of Tokyo, or it was in the Shibuya area. So that even that ties in with Jujutsu Kaisen. So like Horikoshi and Gege have been clearly having these discussions on the way the cults have been tied into their stories and Japanese society, and they both seem to have their own uses for these characters. I don't think Gege is as focused on telling a social commentary as Horikoshi, but that's beside the point. This is just something to think about. Maybe you yourself should want to go and look into more Aum Shinrikyo research and find out what you feel and think about this and how it's been incorporated. You'll find many other examples. I tried to keep this condensed down, shortened for the video. But you'll find plenty of parallels, not only in this series, but also in like JJK, like I said. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you learned anything today, if you feel that this video was worth your time. Like and subscribe if you really enjoyed this. I'm coming back with the Church of MHA and other analysis. I hope that you guys really did get something substantial out of this. There's going to be more videos in line with this topic, because to properly contextualize this, I think I'm going to have to start discussing some of the World War II behaviors as well. So be on the lookout for some more historical tie-in videos with the My Hero content. So yeah, that's all I really got to say for this. I hope to see you Sunday for the Church of MHA. Like, subscribe. If you really want me to get paid, you can join. Have a wonderful day. Aniki out.